Hey there, folks. So while I'm getting this started, just to explain a little bit why there's a second video here, why there's additional thoughts beyond the first video in this page, is because just to be totally transparent, the first video that you watched about novels versus interconnected stories was a video I created prior to the first time I taught this course. I've now been around the block a few times. And having worked with students previously in this class, I thought it made sense to take some of the observations and ideas that I continued to develop about this and some of the things that I saw students doing in those classes and bring them to bear as we get started. Before I get into that, though, first of all, what I want to be really clear on is that this is not a reaction to any implicit deficiency in what people in those past courses were doing. Um, what it is me getting a sharper sense of, I think, what we want to think about when we think about the notion of writing truly interconnected stories as opposed to something else. That said, I don't mean for this to put you under any stress or pressure to worry about whether the things that you draft in this class are actually and actively, I don't want to use the word honestly, because I don't want you to think that you're being dishonest if you don't do this, truly short stories that are linked to each other, as opposed to, as we'll see here, potentially something closer to chapters from a novel. Because I'm less concerned. So what I mean by that is you are not going to ever need to worry about like not getting full credit for something or being the subject of my ire if what you end up producing as drafts in this class maybe do feel more like chapters out of a novel or something like that, or something else as opposed to short stories. Because what is most important is that you are developing as writers, that you are thinking about your writing, and that you are creating material for you to use in the future. Because as I said kind of at the end of the last video, at the end of the day, it's beyond whether you're doing the writing of short stories in a class that's about writing short stories. It otherwise doesn't matter what it is that you're producing. Because if you're producing material that ends up being something that's not a set of interconnected stories, no one out in the world ever needs to know that or will care about that unless you insist on calling them that. So if they become something else, that's okay. And long term, again, while I want us to really be thinking about what it means to write interconnected stories, I'm only so much concerned about that if that is your goal and you are unconsciously not meeting that goal. I hope that makes sense. So these are some of the things that have popped up that I hope will also help us start refining our thinking as we move into our course material. So one thing that I've seen before is writers potentially, quote unquote, mistaking a chapter for a short story. So in times when I've taught this course in the past, the stories that students have produced have sometimes felt a little bit more like chapters from a novel rather than a short story. Again, not anything that I'm ever going to dock you points for, but if you are thinking about writing things that are meant to be standalone stories that also link to one another, chapters of novels can't quite do that. So how does this happen? You might be wondering. Well, what kind of happens is they may mistakenly, and again, I'm putting that in quotation marks, be writing a quote unquote traditional novel rather than interconnected stories or a novel in stories, where they don't think that's what they're doing, but that's kind of what they're actually doing. Again, not inherently bad, but just not necessarily what I want is for people to not think that they're writing interconnected stories, but are in fact writing a traditional chapter by chapter novel. So how does this happen? Well, one, chapters tend to rely far more on context. So you will find that something that feels like it's more a chapter out of a single larger narrative tends to rely more heavily on what came before it for what's in it and what follows it to make any sense to someone. Um, whereas a short story that is connected to another story will be made more complex, or will be able to have additional interpretation when read in conjunction with another story, with that which comes before it, and or once thought about as it relates to that which comes after. But they can be read and fully understood without that context. Okay. So one of the things that I've encountered a few times is writers where we read one of their stories and it makes sense, but then the other story only makes any sense, or they can only read it if they've read the other story. That's kind of one of the metrics you might use to feel like maybe you've accidentally, quote unquote, written a chapter instead of a story. So what are some of the things to look out for that? So I think of narrative foundation. So a short story, in my view, does not rely on readers needing to know another foundational event or person or group of people for the story that we experience to make sense to us. Whereas a novel chapter does tend to rely on this. So a project that I read once that was a really interesting project that a student had come up with, it was kind of a during apocalyptic event. So it took place in this little town that ends up, due to some stuff that happens, isolated from the rest of the world after, like, I can't actually remember what the event is, but some sort of like global electronic meltdown or something like that. And his idea was that he would have some stories that took place the day of that event, some stories that take place immediately after, and some stories that take place well after. All well and good, but part of the trouble was so many of these stories then became very reliant on knowing that foundational event. And so, unless he was willing to write backstory of that event into every single short story, they sort of started to feel like chapters within a novel, because they were so reliant on that particular narratively foundational event. Short stories do each have their own internal narrative foundation. So there is some kind of foundational event that a single story has all to itself. So thinking about what is the fundamental foundational narrative of this particular story. They may, and this is what usually connects them sometimes, is that they refer to other stories' foundational events as side notes, sometimes as background, but you do have to be careful about that again, so you don't have to keep repeating yourself. But they don't rely on those other foundational events to make sense. Okay? So that's just some stuff to think about. Those are things that came up repeatedly in past times that I've taught this course. Now, just a couple of other notes that I would like to make is I'm hoping and assuming, and I'm not trying to be cheeky here when I say this, that you have all read short stories in your time. But I just want to make us all cognizant of the fact that we are reading a different kind of thing than when we are reading a novel or reading a chapter out of a novel. Short stories rarely offer complete resolution. One can easily argue that many novels don't offer complete resolution of all the things they bring up. And so there are, in many short stories, going to be unanswered questions or things that we only get a little bit of context of, that don't get explored fully. But the most important thing for a short story is that they are about some kind of transformation, big or small, intellectual, emotional, mental, physical, literal. But I think about what is the irrevocable change that happens over the course of the story. Something, whether it's large, whether it's small, has transformed in some way, and things cannot be restored to exactly how they were at the story start. This is often something emotional or intellectual, like I said, where a character realizes something about themselves, about the world, about something or someone that's important to them. But it can also be something quite literal, external. A life ends, someone moves away from home, etc., etc., etc. But there's always this irrevocable change. And I just mentioned these as some very brief things to think about, because in the past, when I've taught courses like this, especially as it relates to the model text that we're going to read, when students first started reading them, they were expecting a lot more loose ends to be tied up in the stories that we were reading. And I think that was a result of some students having not read a lot of short stories and having read them as if they are simply small novels, which they really aren't. I have more thoughts on this in the third video on this page, where I talk through some of the layers of fiction that we look for in all forms, but also applicable to short stories, and some things that you can look for as you read our model texts, but also as you write your own. So I hope that this appending video that went on a little longer than probably was necessary gives you just a little bit more to start thinking about as we start exploring the form of the interconnected story.